bem-vindos ao Colégio de São Bento. Eu vou falar em inglês, uma vez que o nosso convidado de hoje não fala português. Hello everyone, welcome to Colégio de São Bento. It is my pleasure indeed to welcome here Andrej Grubačić, a distinguished anthropologist who is going to talk to us about his experience as chair of the program of anthropology and social change in the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. He is the editor of the Journal of World Systems Research, and he also is the founding chair of that Department of Anthropology of Social Change that I just mentioned to you. The main topic of his research is a comparative study of democracies and societies without a state on a world scale. He's the author of several books, including, I would highlight this book, Living at the Edge of Capitalism, Adventures in Exile and Mutual Aid, published by UC Press in 2016. That was awarded, actually, a very distinguished prize by the American Sociological Association. And also another book entitled Don't Mourn, Balkanize, Essays After Yugoslavia. Okay, so I would like to welcome once again Andrej to the stage to give us a talk entitled Marx in California, great title, Report on 10 Years of Teaching Militant Ethnography. Welcome, Andrej.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this kind introduction. Please let me know if you can hear me, and also let me know if you need me to speak slower. But more importantly, interrupt me at any point with any questions that you might have, especially if I mention a name or a movement or a tendency or anything that you might not be familiar with. So if I go too quickly, do let me know. So what I wanted to do today is to remind you of an article that you might have read in 2016 in the journal How. Sherry Ordner wrote a very important piece about theory after the 80s. And in this piece, she wrote about dark anthropology and its others. Now, she was saying that there is this new wave of research that's slowly becoming almost dominant. And that's the wave that she called anthropology of resistance. And anthropology of resistance, she claims, has a dark side, which is the obsession, in a certain sense, intellectually, politically speaking, with power. And probably the best known name there is Marx and perhaps Foucault. The other is the good anthropology, the anthropology that is interested mostly in the alternatives and other ways of being, doing, and existing under, in, against, and beyond capitalism, shall we say. One follows the ethics of probability, the other, she claimed, follows the ethic of possibility. Now, I would like to give you a report or a summary of the work that several of us, my colleagues and myself, did since 2012 at this enigmatic place called California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. It's actually quite a lovely place. And the idea basically is we try to integrate the two. We try to connect the ethics of probability with ethics of possibility, and to try to integrate two kinds of knowledge. Knowledge that was created outside of the academia, and knowledge that was created within, or perhaps at the margins of the science discipline of anthropology. The result is anthropology and social change. And in order to understand where we come from and where our idea came from, we have to go back to 1880s, and that is to Karl Marx, who was already pretty old at that time, and who received a very interesting invitation from a Vieux Socialist from Belgium to do an investigation into something that was called the state and situation of the French working class. Now, Marx, 1880, was slightly confused by this, but he said, sure, why not? And he proceeded to draft a questionnaire that included 101 questions. Now, questions were pretty boring at the beginning. how do you live, what are the lodging conditions, but then he moved on progressively to what are the strikes like, what are the resistance associations like. But what is really interesting in this otherwise a little bit statistic and boring 101 question was Marx's focus on, well, actually his introduction, which is 15 lines that are absolutely magnificent and that go to represent a very important fundamental, even epistemological challenge. He said, well, many people wrote about the state and situation of the French working class. Not a single person has attempted to learn about the French working class from the perspective of the class itself. What we need to do, we need to learn from this class that, as Marx believed, future belongs, and we need to extract exact and positive knowledge about the situation of French workers. Now, this was a pretty incredible formulation. It's a very simple proposition, learning from the working class itself, accessing what he called the proletarian viewpoint. However, there is something interesting there. First is this idea of exact and positive knowledge. The second, Marx actually asked people to give him his email his phone number, to give them, the joking aside, to give them workers' information. And that was actually pretty interesting. The main idea of the whole inquiry was really to create, or Marx lead us to believe, to create and forge connection with the workers. So it was to be also an organizing tool. And we know this because in 1881, he received a letter from a young socialist asking Marx, let's rebuild International Workingsmen Association, let's do IWA once again. And Marx said very interestingly, pointedly, no, there is no organization, there is no theory, and there is no drafting any of the programs for any revolutionary organization before we do investigation. Without investigation, we have no right to speak, let alone compose programs. So he left us with a very interesting idea. Again, is this research really about exact and positive knowledge, or is it an organizing, agitating tool? Also, what is the role of the intellectuals, and what is the role of the revolutionaries who are on the other side, so to speak, and who are trying to relate to the working class? Marx, to the best of my knowledge, never visited California, and he never received a single response to his questionnaire. But another person, whose name is C.L.R. James, did. And C.L.R. James, who is the author of Black Jacobins, probably the best-known Caribbean Marxist, is the name familiar? Black Jacobins, absolute masterpiece. I don't know if you are familiar with his time in the US, in California, but actually everywhere in the US, and eventually in Detroit. He was originally a Trotskyist and a member of a strange sectarian and of one of those weird Trotskyist groups called Socialist Workers' Party. Socialist Workers' Party had a very strange, had a very American idea of how to think about race. It was called Negro Question in those days. And the idea was black and white, unite and fight. C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya, who was the secretary of Trotsky, probably going to go into an incredible amount of detail here, you have to stop me. So they created something that was called Forrest-Johnson tendency. Freddie Forrest was Raya Dunayevskaya, C.L.R. James was Johnson, and they insisted that there are 4 groups of workers, not one. They have their own autonomous needs. Black workers, industrial workers proper, women and youth. And that was very interesting, because that was the first time in politics, it wasn't Lenin, it was actually C.L.R. James, that the notion of autonomy comes in. And what they started doing was very interesting. The first thing, when they became a split from the Socialist Workers' Party, was to start publishing a workers' paper. The name was Correspondence. The first issue was called Gripes, Not Grievances, 1955. And they said something like, if one worker has a problem, that's a gripe. If 10,000 workers have an issue, that's a grievance, that's a social problem. Personal is political. Now this word is extremely important, this phrase is extremely important, because it is going to shape contemporary American left and also academic sensibility to a great degree. giving birth, and we can talk about this, to feminist epistemology and many other things in between. They also said, well, the idea of the workers' paper is to raise consciousness. Now, consciousness raising and also the idea of consciousness is again something that has shaped and informed American radical politics and the academia. Near where I teach, there is a place called History of Consciousness, part of UC Santa Cruz. All of that comes from that particular fervor and intellectual ferment that was started by Sheila James and this much neglected group that at one point had 100 members and 75 FBI informants, which basically led to Sheila James being deported, writing his masterpiece on the Ellis Island about Moby Dick and Herman Melville, and eventually going back to Europe. But the interesting thing about all of this was that the workers' paper they created was called Correspondence. And the idea behind Correspondence was that workers have universal consciousness, class consciousness, these four autonomous groups, but they don't really know what to do with it because they were socialized by capitalism. So there must be some way for them to actually break with the capitalist way of thinking. And the mechanism to do this is workers' inquiry. So that was the first mention of workers' inquiry after Marx's attempt in 1880. And this was now, we are in 1957, and the first workers' inquiry is something called The American Worker by a man whose real name was Paul Romano. And Paul Romano wrote about his life as a worker in New Jersey, in General Motors, I believe, factory. It was a magnificent work, recently republished. It is a sort of self-reflexive ethnographic account of what it means to be a worker in post-industrial proletariat United States. After this, there was another workers' inquiry, and that was probably the best known one, written by Selma James, who used to become Sheila James' wife, who wrote a book which was called A Woman's Place. Now, Woman's Place was probably the first serious treatise on reproductive labor, and something that will eventually lay the ground for wages for housework and many of the feminist analysis. The third workers' inquiry was Archie Cuts Out, about the youth, situation of the youth, and escaping the prisons of the industrial capitalist university system. And the last one, of course, was probably the most important one, Indignant Heart by C.I. Owens, which completely demonstrated in a particularly and painfully autobiographical detail the life of an African-American worker who was born in Tennessee, in the plantation, in the cotton fields, and eventually found his way in Detroit. So these four workers' inquiries and this workers' paper called Correspondence completely reinvented the genre. No more statistics. It was about workers' stories. It was about workers' narrative. It was about beginning from the self. And if you begin from the self, and if your idea is to raise consciousness, specifically class consciousness of these four autonomous groups, you are resolving or you're returning to Marx's admonition in a particular way. It is not about exact knowledge, it is about raising consciousness. It's not a tool of research. Workers' inquiry becomes a tool of organizing. And that, I think, was really important for a group that was coming into existence at the same time in France, and that was socialism or barbarism, remarkably similar to the story of Forrest Johnston tendency. Some of the French most important philosophers of that time came out of this group: Cornelius Castoriadis, Edgar Morin, and Claude Lefort, the famous phenomenologist. Three of them created a journal, Socialism or Barbarism, completely based on this notion of proletarian experience, which had to be somehow translated into existence. Socialism was to be realized and not constructed. And the way to do that was, again, to use workers' inquiry, and they basically created new conditions for the improvement of workers' narrative. Claude Lefort, if you're interested, wrote a magnificent piece about proletarian experience, in which he said, we don't want statistics. We want workers to write about concrete systems of living and thinking of concrete individuals. And the idea that they came up with was the process of osmosis, namely, workers will provide raw proletarian experience, and of course they were French. The intellectuals will provide the theory. And it is going to move in that circle, workers providing knowledge experience, intellectuals, militants providing interpretation and theory. The main person who was behind this project was somebody named Daniel Moth. And Daniel Moth wrote two very important workers' inquiries. One was about Militant Ethnography, a monster factory of more than 30,000 people, where he had his own journal, and also another workers' inquiry known as Workers' Journal. This development had one big problem. They focused on the vanguard, not on the vanguard coming from the outside, but they located the vanguard from within. Semi-skilled male laborers working in Renault and other factories. So there was a very huge, very serious masculine blind spot, so to speak. However, the logic of capitalist development, historicizing inquiry, all of this influenced young Antonio Negri, who was at that time a student living in, well, somewhere in Italy, reading this journal, and he said later, this was my daily bread. And that daily bread was provided by another fantastic militant of the age, whose name is Danilo Montaldi, who has created and improved workers' inquiry further by using oral history, by using plurality of different methods, and moving from spontaneity to what he called the microsystems of resistance, obscured histories and buried networks that we need to somehow figure out how to bring to life. His best student, or best friend, militant, was Romano Italian, Italian anarcho-syndicalist, a remarkable figure, who is credited, he was a young sociologist, and he was part of the, what is called barefoot researchers movement in the 50s, slightly but not too much influenced by the church. And what they did was basically, or what he did, was when Quaderni Rossi, one of the main Italian institutions of the left, was created, he said, enough with scientific, objectivist knowledge of bourgeois capitalist sociology. We want to create something else. We want to create counter-knowledge. We want to create socialist science. Operaia, scienza operaia, worker science. And it is not going to be capitalist sociology, that's not going to be capitalist anthropology, that's not going to be capitalist history, this is going to be counter-knowledge that we are going to use to destroy capitalism. And the main thing that we need to do, he said, is to create counter-research. And that counter-research became known as co-ricerca or co-research. And it is the first fundamental epistemological, again, break between objectivity and subjectivity. Researcher and researched are both subjects. You are inserting yourself into the terrain of struggle in the process that he called contamination, reciprocal contamination and contagion, or horizontal rearticulation of theory, practice, and organization. It removed the idea and notion of the vanguard completely, but it left us again with blind spot. And that blind spot was, it was completely oriented to the factory. So he wrote a report on the new forces, which was, again, a spectacularly well-written piece on Fiat workers, and another one on Olivetti. And it was about the eruption of subjectivity, he called it. And that was really the discovery of subjectivity on the left, or at least on the Marxist left. Well, they have discovered that there is this thing that they started calling the workers' subjectivity. And the main role of inquiry is to become research, militant research tool in organizing, again, factory, mostly factory workers, new workers, who were at that time refusing to work. It wasn't dignity of labor anymore, it was about refusal of work. And that has created a very different perspective, developed later by feminist researchers, and many others who got involved with this, but again, left us with this blind spot of particular kind, which is focus on the factory, and focus on the industrial working class, which is social form of social aristocracy, as Tronte used to say, another Italian operaista, that changed capitalism, but did not change the world. And Tronte said, well, we have to figure out why. And Alquati also agreed with that. Co-research was incredible, but it was too limited. So the last moment in this transnational circulation of this particular inquiry that inspired us so much in composing our program was Argentina. And in Argentina, and specifically around Buenos Aires, in the 90s, there was a complete breakdown of the social contract. Post-Fordist, or whatever you want to call the neoliberal shift in the economy, left many, many people unemployed. And I suppose many of you are familiar with this. The movements of the unemployed in Argentina started doing piqueteros, started creating piquetes, or the roadblocks, and started doing territorial inquiries in order to find out how many unemployed people actually exist in Buenos Aires and around Argentina. And that was very new. At the beginning, these inquiries were fairly objective. Who lives where, how many people have lost jobs, and all of that. But there was again a new turn to subjectivity with the MTDs. These are the movements of the unemployed workers. The first one was 1995, La Matanza. La Matanza immediately created something very interesting. They created a community clinic and they created a school. And what I think is most interesting to us, they also invited local students from social sciences to come and work with them and to organize open assemblies in which they will study not only the objective aspects of unemployment, but also the subjective ones. How is it possible, to put it in Bourdieuian terms, that the violence of neoliberalism was so misrecognized? So they basically came up with three ideas. First, there are people who feel subjectively guilty because they don't have a job. Specifically true of men. If you have seen Naomi Klein's film, The Take, you will see a male worker who is crying, who is completely broken in tears because he cannot support his family. He's not a real man without a job. It was one response. The other response were people who were continually asking the state to do something, and the third one were the people organizing new kinds of institutions and new kinds of forms of organizing outside and against the state. And that led to another MTD, which was called Solano in 1996, which created also a farm and a clinic and many different things. But again, invited people from the local university in Buenos Aires to come and join them. Out of that experience, a new group that's going to completely revolutionize inquiry emerged, and their name was Colectivo Situaciones. Colectivo Situaciones, some of their members were also responsible for the big feminist strike that was in 2016, right? Feminist assemblies and that big feminist moment, which was global. That came out of Colectivo Situaciones in Buenos Aires and some of the main members. But what they did, they said, enough with this nonsense. We are researchers, but who cares? What we want to do, we want to produce knowledge for struggle. What the inquiry is about, it's about production of knowledge for struggle. There is no pretense of objectivity because the very research process is risky. And it is like falling in love. Research is friendship. Research is a process of falling in love in which we lose our identities in the struggle and come up together with different identities. It was a beautiful formulation and it had a great, great influence on many people, including with the name. Militant research. Workers' inquiry has actually become research militancy or militant research. And the main things about it were that it was not about a factory anymore. It was about women's work, it was about the work of the informal proletariat and sub-proletariat, it was about the unemployed. It was also an inquiry into the life of people existing at the edges of capitalism, in these marginal, liminal spaces, where different autonomous, again the word, knowledge was produced. And finally, there is something very political and very productive in inquiry. It is not about what it is, or what is, as much as it is what it could be. It was more and more thinking about how research can create new possibilities. Research into political subjectivities, creating new political possibilities. And that was another very important influence. But to go back to California and to Marx, there was a similar and very important, I think, development in American politics. And that goes back to this idea of personal is political. So a Berkeley student named Katie Sherrichild was created in 1967, I think it was, Radical New York Women. That was a big part of the student movement of those days, and it was targeted by male colleagues as witches coming together, gossip sessions, choose your patriarchal slur. So it wasn't the most popular thing on the left, but it was remarkable because they were completely committed to the idea of raising latent consciousness. And the term that they used was very interesting. The term that they used is waking latent consciousness. So if you have ever heard the term woke in the United States, much in use these days, that's where it comes from. So the idea is to make people woke, to awake their latent consciousness, to translate it into political action, to make personalist political a feminist standpoint, an epistemological tool, which is both a politically organizing tool, but also a way of actually knowing the world around you. The problem, of course, is consciousness is a little bit too vague. What kind of consciousness? Do we all have the same kind of consciousness that can somehow be magically whipped into existence? How do we actually relate to this? These became mostly sessions in which people would be talking about different effects of patriarchal oppression. So instead of doing what the Italians did, which is focusing on rebellion and resistance, they were mostly sharing stories of oppression. That led to another development in American politics known as identity politics. And this is another topic that we can actually discuss if you're interested, but it also led to incredibly courageous organizing, self-managed health organizing, abortion clinics, clandestine networks of abortions that were done. The United States is a barbaric society, as you know this, and you are following what's happening right now with the abortion struggles. It's a terrible place to live. It's a terrible place to do politics. So what Katie Sherrill did was also, she was in touch with some of the most important developments in American politics that go back to the 1930s. And I'm not entirely sure how she was familiar with the work of Miles Horton, but does the name Miles Horton mean anything to people here? It's magnificent. Americans have this incredible ability to forget the most important names and experiences in their past. Miles Horton was basically a theologian who was in the tradition of John Dewey, progressive educator, also Reinhold Niebuhr, progressive theologian. He went to Chattanooga, Tennessee, in the middle of nowhere, but I mean really in the middle of nowhere, to the mountain, and created what became known as Highlander Folk School. And Highlander Folk School became a school, popular organizing school for two huge movements. One is the industrial movement, CIO, so all the important workers and worker struggles were organized at that place. The other was the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was a student, Ella Baker was a professor, Septima Clark was there, Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was formed there. All of the ferment of civil rights movement actually comes from Highlander. And Miles Horton wrote a book with Paulo Freire in Brazil, which was called Making the Road by Walking. And in this book, and in all of these experiences, they're talking about the idea, which is to start with your own personal experience. But you always move from the place where you were. He called this two eyes theory. One eye is looking at you here, the other eye is looking where you are becoming. The idea is personal sharing, beginning with the self, and then personal transformation. And this was until Highlander was actually outlawed as a communist institution in the 1950s. Then it became a school for civil rights organizers, and one of them was particularly important, Stoughton Lind, who became the first director of Mississippi Freedom Schools and Mississippi Freedom Summer in the United States. We're talking about 1950s. You probably have seen movies about this, people getting killed in the South, black and white students organizing together. But the main idea was that Stoughton Lind and his wife Alice Lind created this new way of studying the workers. History from bottom up was actually named after what they were doing in a place called Gary, Indiana. They would assemble the workers, they would put them together in this kind of cross-generational dialogue. Philips tape recorder was invented in 1963. They would bring them with it and they would record all of these sessions. And the idea was to decenter the intellectual authority of the historian or anthropologist or oral historian or an activist, and to basically let the workers themselves do their own history. So history from below is extension of workers' self-activity, because it is workers themselves, people from below, creating and writing and documenting their own history. The role of a historian there, role of a militant, role of an anthropologist, is to disseminate, edit these experiences and make them accessible. It was a role of a facilitator. That led to an explosion of interest in similar stuff. For example, Appalachian studies, community studies in different places in the United States, gay and lesbian museums, queer histories, what is known sometimes as people's history in the United States after the work of Howard Zinn. That was all made possible by the National Endowment for Humanities, which was lavishly sponsoring these things. Neoliberalism brought Ronald Reagan and the end of such initiatives, and they have completely destroyed the funding for all of these community history projects. There's so many amazing things in these archives. It's just fantastic to study these things, documenting their own experience. Now, this has started to change only recently, and I was at the inaugural meeting in 2009, I think it was in Louisville, which was about creation of the Oral Historians for Social Justice, committee known as Groundswell, which are the people, again, trying to go back to inquiry, to oral history, to personal testimony, starting from themselves, in order to think about how to create political transformation. Going back to California one more time, a young student by the name of Charlie Hale was a student at Stanford. He became a very famous anthropologist, Latin Americanist. He went to Latin America to join the Sandinistas, and he was joining the Central American resistance movements, and he was perplexed by the complete inability of anthropologists to do anything useful. So he would say, what are we doing? We are not creating anything that is decolonizing, anything that is liberating. We need to create some other kind of research. That other kind of research which we encountered in Latin America was something that was known as participatory action research, and I suppose that you're familiar with this. He translated this back into Stanford, and later he was teaching at University of Texas, into something that he called activist anthropology, or activist research. And it basically had 3 or 4 steps. First, you're an ally who creates a relationship with the group that you want to write about. Yes, please interrupt.
Who is he?
Charlie Hale, by now I think retired. And he also created a kind of a place within UT Texas in Austin called activist anthropology. It was one of the emphases. But what he did was create this idea of 4 steps, which is, as an ally, as an outsider, you create a relationship with a particular group in struggle. Then you create collaboratively research agenda. Then in a collaborative way, you learn how to democratically really disseminate data and analyze data. And finally, this is an important step, you, together with people that you're working with, you democratically, collectively create the way and decide on the way you are going to be writing about them, because it's considered to be a joint product. So he also was very brave. He defended this on the basis of epistemological privilege. He said we should not be afraid of complexity. Actually, the fact that we are choosing not to be objective, the fact that we are actually trying to tolerate all of these complexities and understand these complexities is giving us a much more richer insight into what is really going on. So enough with objectivity. Objectivity is hiding all sorts of ugly things. Let's embrace the complications and complexity coming from this perspective of being from within. At UC Berkeley at the same time, Nancy Shepherd Hughes, who some of you might have heard of, wrote a very important piece about the ethics of anthropological work, in which he said, we cannot continue doing this post-structuralist, that was the age of post-structuralism, deconstruction. We have to become and embrace the role of compañera. She was working in Brazil at the time. So we need to champion compañerismo, Anthropology is about accompaniment, it's about militant participation in struggle, and my project is called Militant Anthropology. This is the first time that the term militant makes its appearance in the United States, where people still confuse it with military, but it doesn't mean anything good. So basically what she did was, Nancy, was to invite a lot of angry responses, but she was able to educate a whole generation of militant anthropologists who did some fantastic work. Seth Holmes comes to mind, who wrote a book recently translated into Portuguese, Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, about the immigrants in the United States. He actually traveled through the desert from Mexico together with them, got himself arrested, and wrote what he called participatory ethnography, a particular kind of militant anthropology that rests on the notion of pragmatic solidarity. That term was later picked up by the late Paul Farmer. After that, another amazing student of Nancy Shepherd Hughes, Adrienne Pine, wrote a book about working hard, drinking hard in Honduras, and she fell in love with the revolutionary resistance of the nurses in Honduras, who were at the same time being both nurses and resistance fighters. So they created this idea of revolution as a care plan. And Adrienne picked up this extremely interesting notion of somatic solidarity, which reminded me of my old history professor, Jesse Limish, who used to say, tear gas makes you see things more clearly. What Adrienne meant was this embodied somatic solidarity that you experience while you're fighting the police, for example, makes you into someone who can actually understand. Foucault used the term subjectivation, right, to describe these systemic processes of structuring of our identities. It leads to a certain kind of desubjectivation, which is a term that Foucault also uses, but was never emphasized enough, in my opinion. A break, and in that break, somatic solidarity and things that we do together by this embodied resistance in common can create something much different. And she said, I thought that I need to be a good organizer in order to be a good ethnographer. But actually, I need to be a good ethnographer in order to be a good organizer. The situation is inverse. And she started to talk about ethnography as a form of activism, translating experiences of Honduran nurses to American nurses from CNA, California Nursing Association, and then bringing them back to the Honduran nurses, creating incredible form and process of translation, mutual understanding, and yes, somatic solidarity. So these were some of the important influences, some of the important students. The third student, who died recently, unfortunately, was Jeff Juris, author of the book, well, first of the Networking Futures is the name of the book, but the first publications was in 2007 of doing militant ethnography in Barcelona. Now, what Jeff did, and what was so interesting about his work, he moved from militant anthropology to militant ethnography. And he said, I'm not really George Marcus and this whole idea of circumstantial activist want to do it for me. I want an activist who is going to be a real activist, an ethnographer who is going to be embedded in the struggle. And this is slightly different than what participatory action research does, because there is no ethos of emancipation is there. Yes, it is shared. But there is no sense of need, urgency, obligation, responsibility for political participation in power, in participatory action research. Militant ethnography requires you to be political as an activist, to completely abandon any pretense of objectivity and to write from within. So it is even more than co-research. It is completely breaking all of these notions of division. You are writing about yourself, although you're of course not going to write out ethnography, but you're going to reformulate ethnographic practice as Jeff wrote, incorporating the personal, being open to epistemological encounter that is going to transform you personally, and politicizing your written output So he basically said if militant ethnography is writing from the perspective of social movements, then we need to think about what we are writing as something that is crucial and something that is going to live well beyond the archives, something that too serves a political purpose. So whatever you write, it's a PhD, it's a film, it's a book, it needs to some extent to be useful to the struggles. And that was a very important intervention, and that led to the American Sociological Association, to the movement or to the effort to create an activist ethnography section, which was semi-successful. At that time there was already a book that was probably the best book in militant ethnography genre, which is by the late David Graeber, a book called Direct Action and Ethnography, which I would really urge you to read. It's another neglected masterpiece. But with these three students of Nancy Shepard Hughes, we have a very interesting, again, cluster of ideas and concepts and all of these things that were somehow there in the air in the United States when I arrived, knowing already many of these people and many of these theories. And in 2012, after the movement called the Occupy movement, probably remember, one of the main things that we were left with was this idea that social movements need social scientists. They need ethnographers, they need anthropologists, they need people who are writing from within, who are complicating this inside-outside situation, creating these contradictory locations in the research process, but who are also focused on the possibilities. And that became a very important word. What are the possibilities and why are we not studying the possibilities? So those of us who came together to start Anthropology and Social Change went back and we read this whole long, beautiful history of workers' inquiry that became militant research. We read these histories that were not so well known, that are actually real and unofficial history of radical oral history as a science. We read all of these things and of course met with Nancy Shepard Hughes and all the militant anthropologists available, and created a project which was about, and still is, about investigation or militant ethnographic investigation of concrete utopias, possibilities, real utopias. Emmanuel Wallerstein used the term utopistics. So we tried to move from ethics, or to merge perhaps, ethics of possibility, of probability with ethics of possibility that Schurier was writing about. We're trying to see not only what is, but what is already becoming something very different. And these two moments, the ethnographic moment, research moment, and the utopian moment, are kind of suspended in the mutual dialogue. And you do that, and by doing this, you're actually paying attention to some of the most important contemporary movements, like the one in Rojava, where the Kurdish struggle has created and generated incredible amount of alternative proposals as to how to redesign and reorganize society. But I think that since 2012, let's see, make sure we have enough time, the most interesting project that we did was the project of mass inquiry, mass prison inquiry to be more precise. Then what we did was slightly crazy, and I love it. We put students in touch with prisoners in particularly and peculiarly vicious American institution called Supermax Prison. Have you ever heard of that? So there's a place where they keep you completely locked up in a solitary confinement in something that is called SHU, Secure Housing Unit. And where I live, which is California, there are plenty of those. Supermax prisons with SHUs. The most insidious, most terrible one is called Pelican Bay. And there was already some kind of rebellion brewing there. So what we decided to do is to partner up with the only black nationalist newspaper in San Francisco remaining, called Bayview. And we have put students in touch strategically with prisoners, with whom we were cultivating relationships over the years. And students will interview prisoners, and these prison inquiries would then be published, these interviews, in the Bayview. Now, Bayview Journal was distributed to all the prisons. And all of these interviews, so one prisoner gives an interview, everybody reads it. And it became extremely popular. And they were starting to communicate using this. So using these interviews, students were actually helping the prisoners to spread the message, to share their experiences. Now we are going back to the sharing correspondences, sharing experiences, sharing exact and positive knowledge about what is happening, which is also very subjective, about what is happening in the prisons, and also looking at what could be. How can people organize against these absolutely inhumane conditions that existed in these prisons? So what the prison authorities, of course, were on to us, so to speak, so they banned Bayview from the prisons very quickly. However, it was already a little bit too late. So what was created was a group that was called, again, SHU, or Short Corridor, actually, where people of different races, and this is the greatest problem in American prisons, people are divided across and along the race lines. Instead of this, people who started to organize started to use the term prisoner class. And they said, we are not white, we are not black, we are not brown, we are prisoners. We are one race, we are convict race. We are one class, we are prisoner convict class. And we have to unite, because racism is how all of these people, prison, the state, and so forth, keep us divided. So they did something that was, I think, unparalleled in American history. They issued an interracial peace agreement from the prisons to the gangs in California, saying, we need you to stop racial hostilities. End racial hostilities immediately, help us fight this struggle, and let's organize one front that is going to confront the state and capital. This comes from the prisons. Now, of course, the students took a lot of delight and active participation in distributing this message and creating new relationships with people who belong to gangs and different other organizations of slightly more informal organizations in the United States. And this became a truly remarkable experience because it was followed by people that we also alerted to this, which is the Center for Constitutional Rights. They provided the lawyers, and there was a huge lawsuit against the state of California against solitary confinement. Finally, this led to 2 hunger strikes. The last hunger strike, 2013, was the biggest hunger strike in human history, with more than 30,000 people going on a hunger strike. Not a single line about this in New York Times or any of these publications. Nobody wrote about this, except for the Bayview. 30,000 people in 5 prisons went on a hunger strike. Now you can write, you can choose not to write about this, but you cannot completely ignore it if you're a governor. So that went as a lawsuit, and we eventually won. The prisoners had won, and solitary confinement was abolished in the state of California. And to this day, the relationship between the students and between the prisoners, who are now in what's called Gen Pop, general population, could not be more intimate and friendly. So what they have created, this particular kind of mass prison inquiry, was extremely interesting, and many PhDs came out of this, many books came out of this, many essays came out of this, and many of them were actually co-authored by prisoners and by students, which I think was a magnificent success, at least I choose to interpret this, of this particular kind of pedagogy and research technique that we were promoting. And all of this is to say that I think that Romano Italian was right. I think that Karl Marx was right. I think that all of these people, from feminists in American history to people, Miles Horton, to people that I mentioned in France, all of them had a very important point, which is, especially now, when social sciences are sort of breaking down, because the consensus about the liberal social science, liberal centrism, that held social sciences together and gave them a certain kind of identity and sense of purpose, is breaking down. And we need to reinvent social sciences. We need to recreate the world of knowledge. We need to go back to this idea that we were that was removed from us and taken away from us a long time ago, in the 18th century. The separation between the pursuit for what is true and what is just and beautiful. That has been separated since these two different pursuits, since at least the 18th century. Bringing them together, breaking down this idea of liberal organization of knowledge, in which we have political science studying the state, sociology studying society, history providing the national identity and other things that the state needs in order to make us behave. Anthropology studying exotic people living far away, Orientalist studies studying people who once had history, and great empires and cultures, but somehow lost them along the way, developmentalism, all of that. The university system that consecrated this knowledge, this kind of knowledge in the 19th century, and it was something slightly reinforced after the area studies introduction after the Second World War. All of this now is in terrible, and I would say grave crisis. I actually don't believe that universities are going to survive much longer. I'm even less pessimistic or less optimistic about social sciences. But this is not a terrible thing. It is about who is going to invent and reinvent social sciences and how, including, of course, anthropology. Is it going to be a social movement from above, which is how social sciences were instituted in the first place? Or is it going to be a social movement from below, that begins from us, from people who are trying to create counter-knowledge or counter-research for counter-knowledge, that's going to create social sciences that are not in service of reinventing bourgeois capitalist sociology or anthropology, but they're trying to destroy it from within by creating something very different. So this is the end, and I would really like to invite you to ask anything that you might be interested in, and I hope that this was at least to some extent useful to what we are doing in Coimbra. So thank you.
We have about half an hour for questions, which should help us start an interesting conversation here. Let's say that we end the conversation by 4:10. Andrej, thank you so much for this extremely rich presentation, not just about your experience in California, but also this long history of the militant ethnography tradition. I couldn't agree with you more that anthropology has to speak for the oppressed and start with. I think we have to have that clear, because many of us seem to be confused about whose voices need to be heard up there. And also in light of the increasing decline of the role of public intellectuals, right? In the age of social media, when it's hard to distinguish what counts as reliable information, not reliable information, it seems to me that we have very little choice as to whether become or not militant ethnographers. It's the only way to go, it seems to me. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the kinds of projects that your students in California have been doing. I mean, you mentioned the mass prison inquiry, which seemed to be an astonishing success. Congratulations on that. But I'd like to know about what kinds of projects are captivating students in the United States these days. What kinds of militant ethnography projects are being developed? Are there any sort of clear-cut lines of inquiry? Is it social inequality? Are there projects on environmental issues, for example? Can you talk a little bit?
Sure. I mean, what Shirley Ortner was saying in this essay was very important, because she did highlight that resistance anthropology or militant ethnography, anthropology research is becoming almost, not dominant, but it's becoming one of the main themes and main topics. Now, we are the only department that is exclusively dedicated to this. Each department in the United States has one or two, or maybe hopefully more, people interested in participatory.
Okay, so we have the.
I think it's back. Militant, people are doing this sort of stuff. There was a cluster around Charlie Hale and his group at University of Texas. There was militant anthropology, of course, at UC Berkeley. There were people at Stanford. There were people in UNC North Carolina. There were pockets. However, what I think what we have is the only department that does only that. So what exists, what our students are doing, and I'm going to limit myself only to the projects that our students are involved with, we have MA students and we have PhD students. And all of them are going this, I've recently supervised a beautiful book, well, beautiful MA thesis, which did become a book, which was called Birth Work as Care Work. And there was an immensely...
Okay, there's some kind of connection.
I'm going to stop touching it. So...
it needs consent.
It needs... So Alana Apfel is her name, the student. So she came to my office and she said, well, I want to study doulas. And I said, what on earth is a doula? And she said, well, doulas are birth workers. I said, I don't know what it is, but I like the concept of birth worker. And she says, yeah, I want to study this from a Marxist feminist perspective. And in order to do this, birth work as care work was the name of her project, I want to become a doula. I said, again, what is a doula? And it took a long time and 3 independent studies for me to understand. There's something called full spectrum doula, there's a death doula, there's a birth doula. It's basically, you know what it is?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm the only one. So I was educated by Alana in doing this, but she became a doula, and she did incredible work of, working in prisons, working in hospitals, she became one of the main organizers and a really dedicated doula, full spectrum doula, she would always tell me. And she wrote this magnificent research, which was immediately picked up by local publishing house. Silvia Federici and Loretta Ross wrote an introduction. It became a sort of a small sensation because I went with Alana to when she was presenting this book, she did a book tour. And it was really magnificent to see what Jeff Juris insisted on, and Charles Hale as well, which is how you write something makes all the difference. And you have to think about what you write, and something is going to live way beyond your field work. And something that's going to be read by people with whom and for whom you're writing. So every book reading was a meeting. I remember Buffalo and Ithaca. People, nurses, doulas would come together and they would talk, and then the book became a sort of an organizing meeting about how can they organize, how can they make history and social situation better known, how can they fight against the radicalization of the health system, which is a big thing in the United States, as you probably know. So this was actually magnificent. So I was able to see, by following Alana on her book tour, how you can actually use an activist ethnography or militant ethnography in order not only to promulgate beautiful ideas, but actually to organize people through book tours. And the book has been translated, I think, in at least 5 or 6 languages, and it's been used and picked up by French nurses and doulas, and Greek nurses and doulas, and so forth. So that's one thing that comes to mind. Many prison-related ethnographies came out of this. We have many students working with the Zapatistas in Chiapas, and with Kurds in Rojava, and also with Kurdish movement and different experiments in what is known as Northern Kurdistan, and wrongly known as Turkey. So you have people there who are writing incredibly interesting pieces on alternative ways of organizing society through something called democratic confederalism. So I was just on a PhD defense of a wonderful dissertation about forced migration in Kurdistan, in which basically what the Turkish state did by displacing many of the Kurds in the Turkish occupied area of Kurdistan was to actually create through forced migration mechanisms that made the movement only stronger. So it was a magnificent ethnography, and many of the people that we are supervising are actually looking exactly into what is possible. What are people already doing? What are these utopian elements, utopian building blocks of a new society? And these are mostly the topics of the dissertations that people are doing. Now, we have done our best to transform the place where we are, San Francisco, into a place where our department serves as like a community or communal. I actually don't like the term community, it's very popular in the United States. I always prefer the term terrain of struggle or territory or other terms. Americans, when they speak about community, they talk about something very self-enclosed, not so much about social relation that's shared, and that's what we try to do. We try to make sure that people in the neighborhood, people in what is called the Bay Area, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, and other places, know that we exist. So we created a million of conferences, meetings, encuentros, different kind of laboratories when activists, artists, and scholars would meet, translate their experiences, transform them into local and global projects. We would bring people from global south to share their struggles. Ethnography will bring people like Silvia Rivera-Cusicanchi or Silvia Federici to speak about the particular kind of knowledge that would then be taken by students in their own research. And yeah, there's so many of these things that students are doing themselves. There are different kind of guerrilla groups, as they call it. They also use the term guerrilla ethnography, and they do all sorts of guerrilla-like research. They insert themselves into the territory of different neighborhoods, and they try to study what people are doing. For example, in East Oakland, where there's a lot of poverty, but also a lot of incredibly courageous organizing. So these are some of the things.
Thank you. I'd like to open up the debate for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your arm. Yes. Come on. Questions. You can ask the question in Portuguese if you want. Go ahead. Please spell your name.
I have two questions. The first one is relatively simple. It's about Vita and the story that you mentioned about the prison system and how you mentioned that it is very much split along racial lines. So I'd just like to understand better how institutionalized is that. So is it more of an informal situation where that ends up being the situation in prisons, or are, for example, prison is actually subdivided by race and that's a normal institutionalized procedure? So I'd just like to clarify that detail. Another question is a bit more historical, theoretical, and it goes back to the history you mentioned, that you traced all these theoretical traditions and how that eventually led to American identity politics. So I saw there an interesting contradiction in which the tradition that came from workers' inquiry from a very leftist perspective, in which it was about giving voice to the oppressed, led to a development in which this perspective became essentialized, so to say, when only the voice of the oppressed is worth hearing, and then the oppressed is understood as an ever more fragmented and super specific kind of person. So there seems to me to be an essential contradiction between what we today understand as identity politics and these traditions that that precede it. So my question then would be, how do you see this? How do you explain, how do you see this contradiction in terms of?
You are right, it's a complicated question, so let me start with the first one. It's by design. Racism in prisons is to some extent a commonsensical response to the situation, but it's encouraged by the prison. So it's designed by prison authorities. You enter prison yard, you have Aryan Brothers, you have Black Gangsta Disciples, you have Nuestra Familia, you have all of these gangs that exist there. And they have different designs, different ideas, different projects together with the guards, with wardens. So there's an institutional encouragement of all of these things. And you know, there are many good books about this. Luc Vacan wrote about this. Punishing the Poor is a good book that is about this, the kind of racialization of the prison. What happens in these moments that Adrian Pine, following Foucault, calls desubjectivation, at the moments when this somehow the masks fall off, you kind of see this changing. And I remember 1993, there was a place in, where was it? I think it was in Ohio, called Lucasville. It was the longest prison rebellion in the history of the United States, 1993, Lucasville, yeah. And it was a prison where they organized something pretty incredible. It was about vaccination, that people were, Muslim prisoners were very much against because of the substances that they were supposed to ingest, you know, to put into their bodies. They organized a rebellion that lasted 10 plus days, and they organized the whole prison into a democratic council system. So Soviets, basically. It was run by direct democracy, by consensus. It was pretty incredible by all the students involved. Another, the slogan, one race, convict race, comes from Lucasville. The idea of, what was the other? No whites, no blue, no whites, no blacks, only blues, which was the color of the uniform. And there are several good oral histories and ethnographies of Lucasville Rebellion. What the state did immediately, which was fantastic, they immediately singled out 5 people who were the most charismatic, accused them of murder of a prison guard who was regrettably killed in the uprising. And these are the so-called Lucasville 5, who are basically awaiting their execution in different supermax prisons around the United States. So the state response was swift. The state response to what we were doing in Pelican Bay was very interesting. They basically put in the same room all the leaders of the so-called gangs, all the assumed leaders of the gangs, which was not a very smart thing to do, because I guess they were expecting that people are going to kill each other. Instead of this, they started doing something quite incredible. They read a biography of Bobby Sands. Bobby Sands, the Irish prisoner who died on hunger strike. And it's an incredible biography because it speaks about the rebellion of so-called blanket men, an Irish Republican army, and the way that they rebelled back in the day. And this was a tremendous source of inspiration. Then they read Howard Zinn's People's History, and finally they read the Mayan calendar. And they have decided there is this time of acceleration when things become possible. So all of these 6 people of different races, supposedly leaders of different gangs, actually created a political, instead of killing each other, they created a political collective. So then, even more stupidly, the state decided, faced with this prospect, to somehow separate them and send them to different prisons. Now imagine this stupidity. So each one of these talented organizers would start a new movement in a new prison where they would arrive. So all of a sudden, instead of 5 people in one prison, you have 5 rebellions in 5 prisons. So that was pretty dumb, and the state paid the price for this. That led straight to hunger strikes and eventually to them losing the battle in the courts. But again, this is something that has been done systematically in American prisons. The first supermax prison, which was this innovation that was borrowed from Turkey, the F-type prisons, arrived in 1983. It was called Marion Correction Facility. This is when the Americans are trying to do supermax prisons. I don't know how interested you are in this story, but basically back in the day there was something that was called collective prison. And Carl Ginsburg wrote about prison communism emerging out of these experiences. In order to break that, in Northern Ireland, that was the first time when we have this solitary situation, confinement situations. Then the Turkish state borrows the same model. Instead of 4 people, they put 2 people in the same cell. And then the Americans, as always the most extreme and obscene, they create a situation in which there is only 1 person in the cell. So this is the supermax solitary confinement regime. And it's, again, as well as the general population, rationalized by design and by decision of the prison. This is how you keep the prisoners separated. Instead of creating convict race, prison class, and different other kinds of collective emancipatory identification.
Just so details there, in these supermax prisons, do they have associates? Are there no? They are constituted.
You are chained to the desk.
Could you get back to José's second question, the identity politics, and perhaps without wanting to be too intrusive here, to keep the answer a bit shorter so that we open up for other questions from the audience?
It's a difficult one. Recently, investigator and professor from John Jay College in New York, whose name is Christian Parenti, wrote History, Origins of American Identity Politics that he traced all the way back to Herbert Marcuse. I think that wasn't particularly accurate, but he did point out that, again in California, there was this particular system of co-counseling. And co-counseling led to this idea of we are counseling each other on our own oppression. I think that he made a mistake because he is focusing on one experience. I think for me it really begins with what they were doing in the facing reality and for a constant tendency. They were trying to get to the universal proletarian experience. And these autonomous needs of these four groups eventually led to something that is known as intersectionality. And now there are new ways of thinking about theory of intersectionality and different collectives that were championing it. It came out of social movements as a response to a particular kind of identity politics that was focused on the class reductionism. But by removing any kind of dialectical relational thinking, they have created this separate, or they kept the separate categories. And these categories were not exactly intersecting as much in identity politics today as they exist as a fixed essential category somehow outside. So I think there is a really interesting book that needs to be written about how American revolutionary class politics actually created these possibilities for these experiences of wokeness, is the term that's often used, consciousness that's being awakened. Personalist political came to mean something very different that it meant to be originally. It's not that personal is the only thing that matters. It's the idea that you have to relate using sociological imagination, you need to relate personal to political. So this kind of reductionism that's very regrettable that now exists in the United States, I think you can follow it through these. I try to do a little bit of that work, but it's still waiting for a historian who is going to write about this. There is a book called Identity Mistake by Assad Haider that is relatively okay, but it leaves out many of these experiences. So instead of focusing on only one thing, which is what Christian Parenti did, on only one experience, I think it should be read as something that goes back in several different moments, but it does go back to, I think you are right in what I understood implicitly asking, there is something about beginning with yourself, something auto-ethnographic, the narrative of the self, that lends itself to this kind of political thinking. So this is both the exciting and dangerous side where experience becomes everything, right?
Thank you. Could you please say your name, please? Introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. I have two questions. One is, how do you think it's possible to really evaluate the impact of militant research for the political organization, for the group? Apart of your very explicit case of the mass prisoners inquiry, which was, clear, I don't know, what are the criteria to really evaluate, yes, this positive impact? Because I was also thinking about political situation, which you mentioned. I don't know, the practical development of the work within the political field. But I remember when I was in Argentina, there were many friends and militants that criticized also their posture for being supposedly very militant, but at the end a little group of intellectual militants that were producing very interesting and very progressive and radical knowledge, but then what? No? So and in this case, for example, we here, like in a feminist or autonomous movement, we end up reading their works, but always in this kind of intellectual militant class of the movements. So my question is, in their case, I don't want to criticize political situation because I don't have the means to do it, and I really like their work, but the impact is that many other intellectual militants are reading them all around the world, or that their work is really used by the political organizations that are described in their works. And so if you know more about it also. And then the other, it's more a reflection, but yes, that, I don't know, also from my experience in Italy in social movements that take a lot from the workers' inquiry, projecto, etc., you see really how social movements are already done, doing like ethnography, self-ethnography, self-inquiry, and also in the case of the Kurdish movement, no? So I started with some friends of the movement, and I mean, it's shocking how they are already using all these tools of militant ethnography within the movement, no? So it's not like the researcher who is providing tools of producing knowledge, but they already have their tools of self-representation, of science, so what is the militant ethnographer role in this case? I end up with the idea that is like doing a militant translation, so to really go inside and understand their knowledge producing tools and self-inquiry tools, etc., and trying to create a bridge with other movements and also with the academy, no? Trying to be challenged from their work, their methods, which are also very, not individualized. It's not like a group that is doing like the intellectual work, but it's very rotating. So you are doing intellectual work or genealogy, the science work for some time in the movement, and then you go to the diplomatic field. So you are never stuck with this, there is not an intellectual class or vanguard inside the movement, no? And this, I think, should be also something that we as a researcher, also in the academy, should think, no? Also to not be stuck ourselves in the position of always being the, more intellectual militant. It's a little bit confused, but yeah.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think, when we were joking, we were building the department, that we are not going native, we are going fugitive. There's this idea of against medical advice, we're acting against professional advice. Right? So I think there is something, both of your questions actually have the concern with ossifying and separating the intellectual class of researchers, which I think was true for Colectivo Situaciones. It's hard. These are all the problems that academic researchers right now have. You have to worry about, in the United States at least, you have to worry about tenure, you have to worry about staying there, you have to produce not only for your PhD, but if you're a student, you also have to produce for the social movements. You have to figure out all sorts of relationships in your department. There's a lot of work, it's exhausting. So basically it's a sort of a double loyalty that you have to. You have a double loyalty to social movements, you have loyalty to your own work, to the academia, and you have to figure out how to do this. The way that I started doing this, when I write an academic book, I immediately try to write a different version of that book and publish it not with an academic press, but with a press that actually is a movement press. That's one way to do it. It takes a little bit of time, but it's actually quite doable. So rewriting your work so it becomes widely accessible, it becomes a different book or slightly different book, and it's meant for a slightly different audience. Because if you write something for the University of California Press, it's going to be $50 or £50 or 50 euros, and nobody's going to read it. So you basically need to rewrite this for social movements or for people that you were working with. And this idea of being stuck is very interesting, because Graeber and Wengrow in The Dawn of Everything insist on the problem of being stuck. And they identify this as our existential condition nowadays, because we don't have any freedom. We have lost that freedom to move, freedom to be unstuck, freedom to somehow disaggregate, freedom to go back to experiment with different social forms of organization, with different rules that we have in the society. So the question in that book, which is remarkable, is how did we end up being stuck? And how can we actually recreate that freedom that we once used to have? The main premise of the book being that we all lived in societies that kept changing. Now, we can imagine something similar for the universities and for the intellectual work. Refusal to going fugitive, refusal to be stuck, refusal to be assigned a role in. When you come to our department, the first thing that we say is we don't want, and again, this is nothing that we have invented. This is my education at Fernand Braudel Center, where Emmanuel Bollerstein did an amazing work in educating us, was about not creating academics, but creating intellectuals. And by creating intellectuals, he meant people who serve all sorts of purposes in society. You are not here to become a professional sociologist or professional anthropologist. You are here to develop intellectually, so you can do useful things in the world. That was basically the idea. It goes back to Walter Benjamin and his ideas of what a researcher should be, what a professor should be. Well, it goes back to Rancière, who wrote about this beautifully also, when he was talking about finding the common thing, or thing in common, that you do with your students through research. So, instead of just lecturing. So all of this, I think, are different ways of thinking how to be unstuck, different ways of thinking how to avoid, what is the term that Agamben and Negri are using, the constituent, well, there's a term that they're using, I can't remember now, but in any case, whenever you feel that there is an ossification of your role as an intellectual, or for particular intellectual culture, or militant ethnography as a practice, you have to find a way to destabilize it. You have to find a way to recreate it. You have to find a way to go unstuck. Now, I know that this is not answering your question, but it's incredibly difficult right now to prevent the creation of somewhat separate intellectual class. But I think this needs to be our goal. I think that we need to, the role of intellectual, professional intellectual, is to stop being a professional intellectual, is to dissolve. I never believed in Gramscian ideas of organic intellectual because it keeps that fixity, it keeps that externality. I think the role of the intellectual is to, and this is a quote from Negri, to disappear in the masses.
Negri is not the best example of this.
Despite his biography.
All of them, then...
Okay, we have a question.
Yeah, no, you're
Pierre,
right.
tell me,
Yeah,
can you introduce
Gustavo,
yourself,
my
please?
name is Gustavo. Thank you, Andrej, fascinating talk, wonderful history. I love so rich. One additional part of the history that is the only one I knew mostly is the environmental justice movement, which was also very much engaging in this kind of ethnographic research about public health conditions. And so just to add to that, but I was wondering also about the role of the intellectual, and I feel like, and I think your last comment kind of addressed that concern of always kind of catching up to a changing, it's not a social movement, it's a society in movement, as Raúl Civechi would say, it's a changing conditions, and we're always trying to, and the academic work that we do is structured in a way that is so slow that it's never really very useful in the sense of publishing these articles that take 1 year or more to describe or analyze something that is already changed in that process and is already. So that's one thing that I was reflecting on, and maybe you have some thoughts to share about that. But I was also wondering about the challenges or the risks of the militant or the activist intellectual and ethnographies, in the sense of making legible things that shouldn't be legible. So how do you build in your work, or how have you seen that dealt with in the work that you've been studying? That was one question.
I wrote a book about the Zapatistas. When I was preparing to read that book, the research, preparatory research, the best book that I read on the Zapatistas actually came from the American military. Fascinating report on the Zapatistas. And there was, intelligent people writing and making these knowledge quite available and accessible, and I was amazed by how legible it was and how useful it was. And so I would say the traffic goes both ways. We can also see what they are writing, and we can read their legibility is definitely a problem. In one experiment of militant ethnography, I'm not going to name names of books, but a particular ethnographer went to a European city and wrote about the squat culture and made a terrible mess. So at the end of her research tenure there, or when she left, nobody was speaking to anybody else there, The movement was left in shambles, destroyed by different intrigues, fights. Some of the main people left the city, activists. It was like an absolute catastrophe. And of course, that book led to some police actions that were implemented by making these things legible, especially some very sensitive information legible, put this movement into urban housing movement into serious danger. So how to avoid that? By trying to behave as responsible as possible. I don't think that we can eliminate the risk completely. It's risky business. It's going to be risky research. There's a beautiful book, a militant ethnography book called Anarchy in Athens, which was a good Nikos Apoifitis, I think is his name, which is an excellent way of how a very sensitive topic can actually be done very carefully and very deliberately, in a way that it doesn't put anyone in danger. It increases knowledge of people who want to engage and understand the Greek movements, social movements, but at the same time doesn't give the forces of authority too much to work with. David Graeber's book on direct action is full of magnificent details, but they don't put anybody into danger. Use of pseudonyms is also important. There's a famous incident with Nancy Shepherd Hughes where in the Irish village, work on schizophrenia, but that wasn't enough. So there is no real way completely out in terms of safety. You're always risky, but you can do things that minimize the danger of being a responsible photographer and responsible political activist. So that's what I think is the way to do it, but it's a complicated question. I mean, I don't think that there is a safe way out of that.
We still have space for one last question. Raoni, please.
Hi, my name is Raoni. I'm Brazilian PhD student here in Coimbra. It's more a personal question. I want to know what it's like to be an immigrant Marxist researcher in a country like USA, like a right-wing country. How do you feel? What difficult, bureaucratic, difficult, institutional difficulty you have?
completely safe, because in the United States they did a really good job in making everybody who works at the university completely useless and marginal. You can call yourself Marxist, you can call yourself Martian, you can call yourself whatever you want to call yourself. You can be as crazy and wild as you would like. But the only problem is when you actually start doing politics that can affect the life of the university. So you have an interesting separation. You have people writing about very wild things, advocating bank robberies, phenomenology of bank heists. You have all sorts of things that people write about. People call themselves anarchists, people call themselves anti-fascists. There is no real danger there. However, our late friend David Graeber got into trouble in a very different way. So, for example, he was an anarchist writing some of the best books in anarchist theory, anthropology, and he was totally safe. He could do it at Yale. He was teaching at Yale at the time. What got David into trouble and eventually blacklisted not only from Yale, but the American academia in general, is helping organize a student workers, teachers, assistant union. So this is actually something that they do care about. So if you start organizing on campus and helping in real material processes of struggle, for example, helping your students organize a TA, teaching assistant union, you are in trouble. If you're going to write about terrorism and about Unabombers' ideas on nature and stuff like that, you're free to do this as much as you can. So there is no real danger, unless you actually start organizing politically, and then you become disruptive, and then they find ways how to limit your tenure, say that you are not a well-behaved colleague, that you have uncollegial behavior. There was a colleague of mine who is writing a book about all of these euphemisms used to get the radical scholars out. Uncollegial behavior, not friendly, creating disruptions, a cult-like atmosphere in the classroom. There are all sorts of, ways to do this. But only if you actually start to intervene in the business of running the university, if you're involved with the union, or if you, bring general trouble and make yourself a practical nuisance. Other than that, you can be existential, cosmic, ontological rebel as much as you like.
So did the university issue an official statement on the court case regarding the Max prison?
No. No, nothing of the sort.
Interfere in any way? Did they discourage student involvement once the story scaled up into the courts?
No, but this is also, I think there is something to do with the way that students and all of us did it. We did it in a way that we kept a low profile, because we did it, this was a struggle of prisoners. This was a self-activity of people who were in prisons, and we were participating, but we were not the center of the story. So telling this to you and sharing this with you, I think is interesting, because you have the idea of possibility of what can be done in that sense. But making yourself the center of the story, I think, would be slightly indecent, and this is something that we try to avoid. So we stayed away from the spotlight in that sense. But one thing that I haven't mentioned is that we have been organizing for years, all around the United States, classes which are on prisons, in which we would put together prisoners and students. Students would read books. My favorite anecdote is Foucault. Students would read Foucault, Discipline and Punish, and then they would send this to students, and students to prisoners. And prisoners absolutely hated it. They say, there's nothing like this that resembles, they had the same response to Agamben, nothing here that resembles anything of the sort. They had a very good response to Goffman. And I said, yes, this speaks to our experience of total institutions, stripping, all of this, that's exactly what we went through. But this thing of a panopticon, no, they don't care. It's like throwing us into a well, which is a very interesting expression. It's not that they are overseeing us, they just remove us. They storage us away from sight, and this is really what they're doing. It's not about, it's really a storage space more than a panopticon.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrej. I think that's... I think we're going to go from Marx in California.